Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to teach you about two key points to do with farming change. Okay, the first one will be to identify 7 changes and explain to you why the changes happened in terms of how it benefited the farmer, because all of these are changes that have been made by farmers in order to increase their productivity or to increase their profits. So we're going to look to explain each of these, and that the explanation will allow you to answer the first exam questions linked with this. The second thing is I will look at each change and discuss an impact of that change. So what I'm thinking about here is more focused on the negative effects of the change and how those might have affected either the landscape, nature, or people themselves. And those points will help you deal with the second question, which is what's been the impact of these changes. Okay. In the first change, we're going to look at the change from handheld tools, like we can see in this photograph with the farmer pushing a plow being drawn by horses. We would have seen that right through to the 1950s in the United Kingdom, and in many parts of the world, you still see that today. In richer parts of the world, you've now seen the change to the second image, which you can see are large machines, in this case, a combine harvester. To explain that change, there's a number of reasons, but the primary reason is machines have allowed farmers to do the work much faster than at any other point in time. And that means it's sped up the production process for farmers, and that increases their profit. It then allows them to increase their farm sizes because they're able to work more land quickly and therefore own more land and therefore make more profit. So when we explain this change, machines have largely sped up the farming process, allowing farmers to produce more food at a faster rate and own more land. Also, they can do it faster. They can get more crops in across the year. Okay. The impact of the introduction of machines, apart from the positive points that I've just mentioned, have had some negative effects. The first negative effect is that it has resulted in huge amounts of people being made unemployed. And I'll talk more about that in a second in terms of workforces. But large numbers of farm labourers lost their jobs because machines took the role that they used to have themselves. Another negative impact is the carbon emissions from farming has increased substantially because these large machines that we can see in this photograph use often fossil fuels to push themselves around the fields. And as a consequence, that's leading to a lot of air pollution in agricultural regions. So there's a couple of negative impacts. Right, let's have a look at the second change that has happened. And let's think about field size. So what we've got here is a field, kind of typical field pattern of the last century that we saw up until the introduction of large machines. Fields are quite small in this photograph, field sizes. They are divided by hedgerows that you can see. And the actual field shape is quite irregular. Okay. That's what it was. Today, across huge areas of certainly of the developed world, what we can see is now the fields are very regular, rectangular in shape, and they are huge in size. So what's been the impact of this? Well, on the positive side, this has allowed large machines easy access to farmland. They can move around these large fields. You can't really use large machines in small fields. So you need much larger field sizes. Also, you lose less land. If you think about the amount of land that's lost because of these hedgerows and these forests that are in between them, by removing all of that and removing hedgerows and just putting all the fields together, you increase the amount of land. And if you can increase the amount of land, then you can increase the productivity of that land. Right. So that is explaining the change. It's largely to do with machines requiring bigger fields. The impact of that change. So what's been the effect? Well, the effect has been that, yes, the farmers can now produce more food. They can use bigger machines, bigger and bigger all the time. The negative has been we've lost a lot of biodiversity. The removal of these hedgerows and forested environments have resulted in huge amounts of wildlife losing their habitats. That has had obviously a negative effect. Also, another impact of large fields is if you have a disease in one part of the field, it can spread much easier across a wide area. Whereas if your fields are all self-contained small units, if you get a disease in one field, it's much more difficult to migrate to another crop in an adjoining field. So what it means is that farmers in these environments that we can see in this photo rely a lot more on pesticides to control their crops, to stop diseases potentially spreading. Right, let's have a look at our next change. Okay, our next change is the introduction of greenhouses. Now, you don't see so much of that in Scotland, but certainly in other parts of Europe you do. And here we're looking at lettuces growing just using the sun naturally. Now, the problem there is if you get late frosts or early frosts in the autumn, that can kill your crops. It also makes it much more difficult to regulate the amount of water. So you can have a huge amount of rain, these fields could become flooded and your crops could drown and die. Greenhouses, putting them all under glass, allows you to create a stable temperature inside the greenhouse. It increases the warmth, which causes the plant to grow much quicker. And should it rain, it doesn't matter because there's no rain coming directly from the sky. You get to regulate it through these spray systems that you've got. So you can control the environment and therefore increase the speed at which these plants grow. Now, on the upside, that means farmers can grow a lot more crops. They can also grow crops across the year. So as soon as this harvest is down, they can put another one in. And actually, in some parts of Europe, in southern Europe, especially in Spain, they can grow, now because of greenhouses, they can grow crops all year round. So there's a big bonus. That's a positive impact, being able to grow crops much longer in the year than you used to be able to do in the past. On the negative side, though, is that this requires huge amounts of resources to build these greenhouses. They change the look of the landscape. They spoil it very often. It no longer looks natural. It looks like a factory landscape. And that creates a lot of conflict with, for example, tourism. People aren't coming to see this kind of landscape. And also the materials that are used to build these constructions are also harming the landscape in a range of other ways in terms of the amounts of metals and resources required to build these structures. So those are some negative impacts, as well as some positive of the use of greenhouses. Right, the next change is one called irrigation. That's Irrigation. Now, for thousands of years, farming has been dependent on rain. And in Scotland, that's not so much of a problem. We're always pretty much guaranteed rain. But certainly in summer, there is a problem. You might get a shortage of rain. You might have a dry summer and you don't get enough. Or you get the flip of that, you get far too much. But what irrigation allows you to do, especially in drier areas, so you'll see a lot of this in dry parts of the United States and southern England and southern Europe as well, is these large sprinkler systems, irrigation systems. What that means is when through a drier period of the year, you can use water that you've stored elsewhere on your landscape, like in your reservoirs, to spread it onto your crops and ensure they continue to grow through the drier period of the year. So you're effectively getting to control weather. Okay. The impact of that, obviously, is you can increase your crops growing. You can grow them throughout the year. You can even grow crops in very hot regions. The negative side is it requires a lot of water, and you generally have to take that water from somewhere else that might need that water. You might even be taking it from underground reservoirs and you're having to pump it up. So eventually you might see the water that's stored on your landscape run out, and that's certainly a problem in some parts of the world. Okay, our next change. Now we've referred to this shrinking workforces. In the past, you would have seen in any given field hundreds of workers, whether they were planting or preparing fields, ploughing or harvesting. An average farm employed a huge amount of. Today, a farmer really just employs himself, maybe has one or two other permanent employees if he has a big farm, but generally all other work he needs, it gets contractors in to maybe come and drive his harvesters for a week when harvesting's happening. He might even not even own these machines. He might even rent them. And the reason for that is it's much cheaper for the farmer to reduce the workforce because that's a cost. So they don't need to be employing people all year long. And therefore they can make more wealth for themselves. The negative impact of reducing the number of people you employ because you're using machines and outside contractors is that it makes a lot of people unemployed in those rural areas. And the impact of that is that people become quite poor. So you get a lot of rural poverty in the countryside because people can't find work anymore because farmers don't need them. What that then does is it triggers a lot of people, young people especially, moving to the cities to look for work. So they leave behind the countryside in which they've grown up and they move to the city. Okay, next change. So what we can see is the thing that gives anyone who lives in the rural area will know this, that lovely smell that you get in rural areas. And this is just manure, natural manure. And farmers have been using manure on crops to help the crops grow for a long, long time. This goes back to the dawn of agriculture, spreading muck on your crops. Today, you see a lot less of that, certainly in the richer parts of the world, and there's a much bigger reliance on fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. So this is almost like a chemistry experiment in this big container here, and the farmer's spraying these on the crop. Now, the advantage of this is the farmer gets to then control the amount they put on the crop, and these specific chemicals are designed to maximize the growth of the particular crop on which they're being sprayed. Therefore, the farmer gets to enhance the size of the crops and increase their profits because their crops are much bigger. Impact. So what is the impact of this? Well, the negative impact is that these chemicals often wash off the crops and get into local riverways and river systems and drain into the soils. And over time, these chemicals can build up in the soils and in these water systems in lakes and rivers and actually become quite toxic and kill the marine life that's in the rivers or kill the bacteria and the microbes that are present in the soil. Not normally the first time you spray it, but it's over years of doing this spray that these fertilizers build up and cause environmental damage. Okay. And our last change is the idea of pesticides. So in the past, farmers had to accept that they would lose a reasonably large portion of their crops to insects. Sometimes their entire crops might be lost. For example, the locust here, certainly even today in parts of Africa, when a locust swarm descends on a crop, they will strip the entire crop and the farmer might lose absolutely everything. But aphids, weevils, beetles, and a whole range of other pests are a threat to farmers across the world. In richer parts of the world, what we do is we use pesticides. And so each spray is designed to kill a specific insect. And farmers will put these on, and that will ensure that their crops cannot be eaten, and therefore that will ensure their crops grow better and they can make much higher levels of wealth. Now, the impact of this is very similar to chemical fertilizers. It can be very bad for the soil when it builds up over time. It can be bad for riverways. It can actually also be bad for the farmer's health. Certain pesticides can damage farmers' health if they're exposed to the fumes that come from these pesticides. So you have to be very careful if using some. That's a negative impact of the use of pesticides. Okay, you now need to use all the knowledge I've built up to answer the two questions, explain the change, why did it happen, and then and what was the farmer trying to get out of making the change. That's the first question, and the second question will be to explain the impact that this change has had on the people and the landscape.